Hi everyone, another week, another update, and this week I'm going to do a whole bunch of sort of little stuff, talk about one bigger thing, and I don't know, it's like always, I don't know how long this stuff takes. I just sit here and kind of wing it. Now, having said that, for those of you watching as opposed to listening, if I do look like extra disheveled and non-professional, as I'm prone to do living in this environment here, I've just wrapped up a 2-day remote workshop for holiday extras. And I can talk about holiday extras because they did tweet it this morning and said how much fun they had, which was nice. So I've been doing these remote workshops for a little while insofar as that they're sort of a good model to take what I would normally do on the other side of the world and do it from this environment here. That's the good bit. The bad bit is because Australia is on the absolute other side of the world to absolutely everywhere, the times are crazy. So I normally try and split a 2-day workshop into 4 parts, and then it becomes like 4 3.5-hour parts. And you can usually find 3.5 hours that are mutually compatible with 2 different sides of the world. But in this case, we want to do it in sort of 2 parts, so to actually do like 2 full days, which means I've just had 2 days of doing workshops from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. And I'm a morning person, which did make life a little bit tricky. But be that as it may, it's really neat doing workshops from here because, hey, I'm going to be tired one way or the other. I'm going to either be jet lagged going to the other side of the world, or I'm going to be staying up late. But when I stay up late here, I get good coffee, I get to see my wife and kids, which is really nice. I can then chill out in the sunshine for the rest of the next day, which is exactly what I'm going to be doing for the rest of today. So the remote workshops are awesome. I'm going to put a link in to when I launched those last year as well, because they are allowing me to do a lot more stuff without having to put the effort of travel in. And incidentally as well, while I remember it, I'll also link to this, but Scott Helm is doing workshops for me as well. In fact, I'm going to start to list some of the public events we're doing. So Scott's got one coming up in the UK around the middle of the year. I've got one coming up on the Gold Coast right outside here in a few weeks' time. One in Oslo coming up in June, and one in Sydney coming up in September. So I'm going to list all of those there. And of course, we're both doing a bunch of private ones in different spots around the world too. So, workshops are good. Now, what else is happening this week? Saturday, there was, how shall we put this? Somewhat of a milestone, I guess, for want of a better term. Have I Been Pwned past 5 billion records? Now, this doesn't kind of feel like a celebratory thing, though, does it? Because we're saying there is so much breached data out there, we've just rolled over the big 5B mark. And, you know, normally you'd kind of celebrate big numbers like that, but you see where I'm going. Like, it's not a good thing that we have so much data exposed. Now, you know, keeping in mind, again, I built this thing originally with I think it was about 155 million records, and I thought that was massive. You know, that was huge. I've been doing lots of talks about Have I Been Pwned. I remember some of the early talks were things like lessons I've learned from 220 million breached records. And then it went to lessons I've learned from 1 billion breached records, and it just kept kind of going and going. One of the really interesting things about the way Have I Been Pwned has grown is the 5 billion records today still sits on precisely the same underlying architecture, infrastructure, everything else as the 155 million records. So it still sits in Azure table storage. We say Azure here. I know Americans say Azure. Anyway. So it still sits in Azure table storage, and it still costs, it is a little bit more now, but it's like in the tens of dollars per month for the storage component of Have I Been Pwned. Still scales beautifully in a sort of totally linear fashion, so I never see any performance bottlenecks on the table storage side of things, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing, and it actually works really well. So I'm sort of really stoked that decision, which was partly good management, partly good luck, if I'm entirely honest. I didn't know how it would perform when it got to this size, but clearly it's still working very well. So one other thing on Have I Been Pwned while I think of it as well, I have sort of consistently large floods of data coming in. There are multiple breaches I'm currently trying to deal with that are all tens of millions of records each. And I'm trying to go through this process of, does the organization know about it? They're not always in English-speaking countries either, which makes life a lot harder. Has it been in the press? How much disclosure do I have to do in order to get the data out there? And that, I've really got to give more thought to how to do that more efficiently, because I've got this backlog of stuff that I'm trying to do the right thing with in terms of letting companies know, but I got to get it into Have I Been Pwned in order to let people know as well. So it is a constant challenge. And I am thinking about ways to tackle that. I do appreciate all the sort of suggestions of support, etc. I get from people. They are awesome. I don't think I'm quite at the point where I can kind of delegate that at the moment. But certainly all the well wishes and thank you very much for what you're doing are very, very nice as well. So thanks for that. All right, that was the 5 billion. Couple of other things just on this sort of start of the weekly update, which is all the random things. Something very exciting for me. My bandwidth, my upspeed bandwidth, went from 2 megabits up to 5 megabits. Isn't that exciting? Like, here I am getting excited about 5 megabits up. It's terrible. In all seriousness, what has actually happened is, and just to scroll back a little bit as well, some of you probably heard this before, but bandwidth in Australia is very, very sucky, particularly on the upbound connection. So I constantly get 100 plus megabits coming down, which is reasonable. You can do a lot with that. But I was consistently only getting 2 going up, which is why I'm recording this video now at 9:45 in the morning, so that I can hopefully get it uploaded in time to publish it by about 6 p.m. my time. Like, this is the craziness of how bad it is. And then if it drops out halfway through, or I have problems, or I'd realize that I've gotten something wrong and I need to edit like a title because I spelled the sponsor name wrong or something stupid like that, you start again. So it was an absolute pain in the ass. So going to 5 megabits is actually a big win, 2.5 times faster. The problem I'm having, and I'm going to look at my stats again now, is that in all their wisdom, Telstra, our big telco down here, maybe it's their wisdom, maybe it's the wisdom of the modem I'm using, which is the modem they gave me. For some reason, the connection is like, okay, I get 5 megabits, and then just degrades all the way back to 2, and it flatlines at 2, and then I do what I just did 20 minutes ago. I go down, I turn the power off, I turn the power back on, speed goes back up to 5 megabits, and now I'll be able to watch as it slowly degrades back down again, which is kind of depressing. But hey, here we are. I'll go and, I guess, sit in the sun and console myself with the other nice attributes of Australia. All right, so part of the reason why upspeed is important at the moment is I'm rolling over backup providers as well. And I've been tweeting a bit about this publicly, having some discussions with people about cloud backup solutions. Now, I don't want to go into all the details of what I back up and where and how I do it, because there's a certain amount of, I guess, operational security, for want of a better term there. But I have a very robust strategy where certain things are backed up to different physical locations, different hardware devices, different off-site locations. But one of the things I needed to do was replace a crash plan. So I was backing up to crash plan for quite some years, a certain segment of my files, and they're discontinuing their service. Wanted to find another one. And I was saying to people, look, I would like to find an online backup service which has, first of all, 2FA on accounts. Seems like a pretty basic thing these days. Has a client that can run on a Synology NAS. So this was really important. CrashPlan could never do that short of a really nasty hack. And the other stuff I wanted was like a proper dedicated backup client, which would allow you to do things like encrypt the data before sending it back up, because I don't want to put plain text files up in anyone else's cloud in terms of this particular class of data. And just in case you're wondering, no, this is not data breaches. Data breaches never get backed up to the cloud. All of that is very physical devices that sit in safes and highly secure on-site things, geo-redundant as well. But again, I'm not going to go into that too much. Now, I had lots of people come back with different suggestions, some of them good, some of them not so good. And I want to qualify what I mean by that. For me, and let's just put this in consumer land as well. So the class of data that I'm actually backing up here is very sort of general consumer data, the same stuff that your families would be creating when they write documents and things like this. I wanted something which was a consumer product. So this would be the sort of things that you might set up for, say, your non-technical parents, or what you might tell your friends to go out and use. And what that means is lots of clunky things that you have to roll yourself is not really going to work. There are a lot of people saying, well, why don't you use rsync and you push it to an S3 bucket and you encrypt beforehand? I don't want to join all those dots. I want a sort of proper turnkey solution that's supported by an organization. A couple of people said, shouldn't put anything in the cloud, can't trust the cloud, you should have physical hardware somewhere. It's like, I'm not going to put my own server in a data center and like physically manage the mechanics of it. Like we're past that era. And besides, once you get to the point where you can do things like local encryption before pushing files remotely, and we're talking about files which are things like Word documents, family photos, that kind of stuff, I'm very happy with the security posture of that solution. Now, a bunch of people said use something like S3 or Azure Blob Storage, and then you can use the Hyper Backup application within the Synology NAS to push it up to there. The main problem with those models is that the storage is massively expensive. And if you have large volumes of data, you get really, really pinged for it. The best model that I came across, and the one that I'm now using, is Backblaze. And Backblaze do just massive volumes of storage. Their sort of headline act is that they are much, much cheaper than the alternatives in terms of storing large volumes of data. So, looked at Backblaze. Backblaze has a client on the Synology NAS. There's the Cloud Sync app, which allows you to sync with the likes of Dropbox, etc. You can also sync with Backblaze. That client on the Synology NAS does allow you to encrypt files with your own encryption key, which you provide or you provide the password for the encryption key into the Synology NAS. So you encrypt everything locally before it then goes up into Backblaze's cloud. Now, that's kind of cool. Someone did actually make the point, be conscious that your file names are still visible. So you can go in, see all your file names. If you pull the file down, you can't read it. Not unless you either sync it down via the Cloud Sync client on the NAS, or there is a little application you can download from Synology which will allow you to decrypt files once you provide the key into that file. Which is fine, because in this particular case for me, this is like a big disaster has happened and I need to go and grab something. This is hopefully never need to actually access the data anyway. So Backblaze is pretty good along those fronts. The pricing is super, super efficient, as I said. What else is significant about that? If you've got a lot of data, you need a good upspeed connection in order to sync it. Let's not talk about that again. So anyway, that worked really well. A few people were saying things like Dropbox. Look, Dropbox is great for sort of the operational sharing of content between each other. It gets a little bit painful for more traditional backup style approaches. Part of the thing that's a bit painful for that is the retention period of versions, which from memory it retains about like 1 month worth of versions. So if you've really, really cocked something up and you need to go back to it, that may not help. Backblaze has unlimited versions, and this is their Backblaze B2 storage. They've got a different model, which is actually a client which can run on the PC and do backups from there. I'm obviously using the Synology client, pushing to B2. So that was sort of the, I guess, consistently the most highly recommended service. And now having used it, it is actually very good. It looks fantastic. And I was sort of very cautious. I thought, I'll sync like a tiny subset of my data, see how it goes, go through the decryption restore process. Do check your backups restore. Backups aren't very good if they don't restore properly. So anyway, that was all that. I'm happy with that bit. Now, a couple of other things as well, and I know this is just kind of a very newsy thing now, but I thought it was interesting. Barclays Bank in the UK. Now, going back, must have been about 6 months to a year that I first saw this. They had this advertisement, and I'm going to actually read part of what's in the advertisement. They've yoinked it now for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. But what they're trying to do is tell people that in order to be secure on the internet, in order for your transaction to be secure, you need to look for the padlock in the browser. Now, what I think is a really interesting narrative around padlocks in browsers is that they are visual controls. And what I mean by that is that the reason we put the padlock in the browser is so that people can look at it and go, okay, I see a padlock. I can now draw some conclusions as a result of that. Now, what we have been teaching people for many, many, many years is look for the padlock, and that means you can trust the site. Now, I had a little bit of an argument with Scott Helm about this online the other day. And maybe we'll have this argument in the weekly update in a couple of weeks when he's here, because I think it's a good argument. And he said, look, it never means trust. Trust is the wrong word, etc., etc. He has some valid points. I think if you were to ask the average everyday person on the street and say, you know, what does it mean when you see the padlock on the site? They would say, it means I can, air quote, trust it. You know, so what does that mean? It means that I will give it my login credentials. It means I'll give it my credit card, because it is an indicator of the trustworthiness of the site. Now, most of you will know that the padlock is really just saying that you have got a TLS connection. You've got HTTPS between the client and some other point. Now, that other point may be the server at the other end. That other point might be some load balancer very close to the server. That other point may just be Cloudflare's edge node around the block from you, and then everything else is in the clear. You don't know. So the padlock only gives you confidence about encryption from your client to a point. The other thing is that we know that the padlock doesn't tell you that they're nice people on the other side of it. And this has become particularly interesting over the last couple of years as Let's Encrypt has gained a lot of traction, and we've seen more and more free certificates easily available, domain validated certificates, so the only thing you've got to do to get it is to prove you control the domain. We have seen a heap of phishing sites pop up running over HTTPS. There is a whole other debate about why that is actually okay. I know that upsets people, but it is okay that phishing sites have HTTPS in the same way as it's okay that ubiquitous end-to-end encryption is available to everyone, whether you're a good guy or a bad guy. So the problem we got now is that increasingly the padlock means less about you should give your information to the site because it's legitimate, and it means simply the mechanics of it. You have this sort of encryption between the client and some other point. Getting to the Barclays point, or the Barclays story here. So Barclays was running this advertisement. I'd seen the advertisement online. It's a video. I don't know if it was on TV in the UK as well. And what happens here is it's talking about someone shopping and buying a toy online. And in the advertisement, they say, right, before you pay, look for a padlock and always check the seller's genuine. You don't want to get scammed by a fake site. And a bunch of us were looking at the time going, but what about all the fake sites with a padlock? This is misleading. This kind of doesn't really make a lot of sense. Anyway, they have now been pinged by the ASA, which is the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK. And ASA had apparently received 15 complaints, which was enough for them to look at the advertisement, review it, and go, this is misleading. You've got to yoink it. So here's sort of the first part of this piece of the news, if you like. They have yoinked the advertisement because telling people just to look for the padlock and then make a decision about how trustworthy the site is based on that alone is no longer sufficient. It's actually misleading. So that's interesting. Now, the bit that I thought was interesting, the other part of this story, and the thing that Scott and I inevitably had a little argument over, a very friendly argument, is that I propose that we need to change our view of security indicators and move away from look for the padlock because it means the site is safe, trustworthy, whatever word you want to use, and instead say look for the absence. If there's an absence, you definitely can't trust it. Now, this is important because in that first model, the one where we say look for the padlock and then you can trust the site, this doesn't fly anymore. This is why Barclays got pinged, because we see phishing sites with padlocks. We're going to have to talk about other ways of making trust and value decisions or legitimacy decisions other than just padlocks. A whole other discussion there for another time. But I think the one thing that we can start to agree on is that we've got to flip this and start to say look for the absence of these positive visual indicators. Now, I'm a little bit cautious there as well because I am definitely on the record of saying telling people to look for the absence of, say, EV certificates and behave differently is just never going to work. And there's a whole set of other problems with EV. But in terms of padlocks, we have consistently convinced people to look for it. And it made sense at a point in time. Now, this idea about causing people to not trust sites that have an absence of positive security indicators does sort of align with what we're seeing with Chrome as well. So if you recall, Chrome back in January last year started saying not secure on any website with a login form served over HTTP. So what we're seeing now is a negative visual indicator. And then time went by and they started saying, okay, well now, and this happened around October last year, now if there is an input form on the page and you put some text in that input form, we're going to say not secure. Doesn't even matter if it's not a password. It could just be like a search field. And next, in June this year, assuming they're still on schedule, they're going to flag every single non-secure site. Let's actually clarify that. Every single resource served over HTTP. So if you go to an HTTP website, it's going to say not secure. And I think the thing that we've got to really start hammering on people is focus on the not secure. When you see not secure, don't trust it, or whatever word Scott wants to use. Don't put your credit card info in there or your password in there. Get the hell out of there. This is not a good place to be. That is a much more reliable message than saying to people, look for the padlock and then trust it. So anyway, I think I'm going to write something on that because I personally, I think that is actually a good sign because we're saying that there's so much HTTPS out there everywhere. We now actually need to change the way we look at it and sort of be, focus on the negative indicators. So it's a good sign, but we do have to think more about the way we communicate what the indicators mean as the tech landscape changes. All right, there's that. Now, one more thing before I start talking about blog posts. And I know I'm like 22 minutes or something into it already too. There was a really interesting case this week, and I'm actually going to put this in a few talks because it's a really kind of, it's kind of cool and crappy at the same time. And this was a case where someone has got themselves ransomwared, so they have their things infected. They have gone to a data recovery specialist. They have paid to have the data recovered. Data recovery specialist has actually done a good job. Turned around very quickly, here are your files, decrypted. I would imagine that having seen that, the customer would have been quite happy, were it not for the fact that this data recovery specialist actually just paid the ransom. And it's kind of curious the way this all then unfolded because the FBI got involved. And we've got this search warrant here which has popped up where the FBI wants to come and get access to the company's things because it looks like they've just been paying ransoms rather than actually decrypting files per the actual instructions of the owner of said files. The thing that I thought was really interesting with this, and I know some people don't like me saying this, but I'm going to do it anyway. The ROI on paying ransoms is often very attractive. This company has been able to make a business out of the fact, or certainly they have done business out of the fact, that paying the ransom makes good financial sense. So I think the company paid like $6,000 or something. So they've taken the $6,000, maybe it cost them $4,000 to actually pay whoever it was that ransomed the things, get the decryption key, plug it in. Job done, here's your files, they get a couple of grand, they're happy, ransomware guys are happy as well. We don't want them to be happy, but you see the point. So that's just a weird set of economics in terms of the way ransomware is working. Now, I don't want to see ransomware paid. I don't want to see ransoms paid. We want to get away from this. But it is an interesting outcome. And in this talk that I'm going to roll this into, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history of ransomware. Ransomware actually goes all the way back to the 80s when it was distributed around on floppy disks. True story. So anyway, that was just kind of a weird thing. Now, let me move this forward because I want to talk about a little bit about a blog post from last week, and then I'm going to talk about a new one from this week. And I want to go back to the whole thing around enumerating and whether or not enumerating paths is hacking or not, whether you should go to jail or not, what should happen as a result. Now, as a very, very quick recap, this was due to a 19-year-old guy in Canada downloading a bunch of information from a Freedom of Information site by enumerating through paths. So he obviously figured out that, isn't this interesting? Every document just pluses one, and then we have a new file. If I keep plussing one, then I'll get all the documents. I can save them offline, search them locally, do whatever I want. This, based on the way it's been represented, is very benign. And any reasonable person would go, yeah, that's fine. He's just downloading things that are published to the web. Then the Canadian Mounties, I don't know if it's the Mounties or whoever it is in Canada, turned up and got the guy into somewhat of trouble. I believe they took his toys away, got arrested, facing charges. Not real pleasant. And if you recall last week, my angle on this blog post was for all the people saying it's facing the public web, there's no protection on it, it's an absolute free-for-all, you can do whatever I want. That's not how it works. Now, I want to be clear again, as I was clear last week. This is not to say the 19-year-old guy... Let's try this again. I told you it was a late night. This is not to say that the 19-year-old guy did the wrong thing. It sounds like he's getting a very raw deal out of this. It is also not to say that everything that is publicly facing and accessible, even if the owner of that data has totally screwed up their permissions, is free game. And I gave examples of things like, I talked about a couple of use cases or precedents here where people found that you could +1 and pull someone else's personal data. Either their personal information, in some cases their financial information. And then they went through and did it 100,000 times. This is not okay. And you know, frankly, I don't care whether it's legal or not. I actually was very conscious not to use the word legal when I wrote the blog post. Whether you think it's legal or not, whether you think it's okay or not, this is the sort of thing that causes the cops to turn up on your doorstep and take your toys away. Because you have just accessed a huge amount of personal data. Now, this so far is just the recap stuff. A couple of other things have happened since then. One is that I got sort of inadvertently drawn into the debate about the legitimacy of this because the CISO of Nova Scotia wrote a LinkedIn post and linked to my post and said this is a very rational view, which was nice, thank you for that bit, and then went on to make 3 points, which I'm going to say I agree with, but I also think are a little bit tone deaf under the circumstances. Now, here are the 3 points. One was the media likes to sensationalize things. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. 2 was that there was information about this incident which was not publicly known. Now, I'm sure that is the case. And 3 is that attribution is different to intent. So what I think he was trying to say here is that they've clearly been able to attribute the activity to this 19-year-old guy, but the intent is a different story. So establishing the intent is a different process to figuring out, were you the guy who did it or not? Okay, yes. Why were you doing it? What were you trying to do? So I don't agree. Let me rephrase that. I don't disagree, at least by the definition of those 3 bullet points, what he said. The problem is that the guy dug himself a little bit of a hole because now he's in this position where he's saying, you guys, the media covering this, are sensationalizing stuff. You really don't want to have arguments with the media. Like, they're the ones who control the messaging, so that's not good. The other thing is he's saying there's more to the story, but I'm not going to tell you what it is and effectively just trust me. That's not going to be well received by people. That was not well received by people. And in fact, people chimed in and started commenting on the LinkedIn post to that effect, saying, look, if there's more to it, then you need to tell us. I added a comment as well, and I said, look, I agree with your 3 bullet points. However, if you want to try and swing this public perception, so obviously he's written this as a result of getting a lot of bad press, then you need to come clean about what the other information is. Maybe the guy's done a whole heap of really, really nasty stuff and he deserved to be picked up. I don't know. Whilst there's no evidence about that, and whilst it's not shared and it's not publicly facing, we can't sort of draw that conclusion that it was reasonable, because on the surface of it, it looks pretty shitty to have picked the guy up. Now, he subsequently, this was on Sunday as well, incidentally, at least Sunday my time, subsequently obviously decided that post wasn't a very good idea and deleted it, which in some ways kind of makes things worse because, of course, everyone's already screen capped it by then and the story's spreading. And then it's like, oh yeah, and now the guy's recanting on this. I suspect he got a little bit of pressure from someone internally who said maybe it's not a good idea to talk about ongoing investigations. Maybe it's not a good idea to effectively put a bit more fuel on the fire. So that was a bit problematic. Now, that is one eventuality since we had this discussion last week. One thing in terms of some of the feedback that came back after I wrote that blog post, and I think from memory, this was the 20th of April I posted it. So when I did my video last week, I said, look, I've just posted this thing. Don't know how people are going to react. Let's do the update. One of the things that did surprise me a lot is the number of people who came out in defense of Enumeration. Put the Canadian thing aside for a moment. So in defense of, There is a number in the URL, we can increment it, that's fair game because it's publicly facing. I want to be sort of really clear here that we've got to appreciate that there are a lot of nuances with this in terms of intent, in terms of how you found the vulnerability in the first place, in terms of if you accidentally mistyped a URL. But there are also aspects of this which are crystal clear. And one of the things that's crystal clear is that once you start seeing other people's data, if you keep hammering away and pulling more data out, there are going to be processes that are set in motion as a result of this. Now, here's what I mean by this. Imagine you're working in an organization that has an enumeration risk, direct object reference risk. You got an ID, change that ID, you get a different record out of the database. And you discover that someone has pulled one other record out of your database and they've seen one other person's personal data. Now, inevitably, the right thing to do is you're going to have a discussion with the person whose privacy was impacted and say, look, we need to let you know your data was accessed in an unauthorized fashion. Here's what happened. Here's what we've done about it. And that may well be the end of the story. Put yourself in this person's position. So the person working inside the organization having to deal with the fact that there's been an unauthorized access to data. What are you going to do if 100,000 records have been accessed by someone? This is no longer going to be a quiet discussion. There's going to be legal people involved. You are probably going to have to report it to the local regulator. Let's say the ICO in the UK or the Office of the Information Commissioner here in Australia. There is probably going to need to be notifications sent to 100,000 people, which means it's going to be in the press, which means it's going to blow up into a much bigger thing, which means you're also going to get pressure from your legal people about what sort of action needs to be taken about the individual who pulled the data out. And again, it doesn't matter whether it's legal or not. The fact is you're going to set these events in motion. So in that blog post, I linked to a talk I did at AusCert where I said, look, you should +1 and stop there. And the whole premise was, for those of you who are in security capacities or development capacities and you're just curious and you're changing a URL, as soon as you see data being returned, which you know is not meant to be returned, again, this is not to do with the Canadian bloke. When you see your bank account and you add 1 and then you see someone else's bank account, that's where you want to stop. Now, I made a couple of notes on this because one of the things that struck me whilst people were arguing about the right for people to go and pull large volumes of data just because it was unprotected is have a think about a few things here. So, have a think, for example, if you saw a vulnerability, say in a bank like this, and you are of the view that it is publicly facing data, it's published data, and you want to keep +1 100,000 times, would you do that from your own IP address? Almost certainly not. Would you tell your kids it's okay to do this? Almost certainly not, because you know what will happen as a consequence, what will very possibly happen. So this is sort of the point I want to leave that part of the discussion at. We have a pretty good sense of when it is crossing the line, and whether you think it's published and it's public and it's legal or not, this is probably not going to work out well if you do that. Okay, now, moving on to this week's blog post. One of the things that happened as a result of that whole Canada and enumeration and everything thing is people tried to come up with all of these analogies to describe the in real life, often referred to as IRL, equivalent of the action of enumeration. So people would say things like, let's say the folks who are trying to justify the ability to access the data. They'll say, well, if you left the front door of your house open and someone came in and took something, then really that's your fault. Incidentally, a lot of people like to call this victim blaming too. You don't want to go down that path. Those people get very passionate. But this was sort of the IRL analogy. And in fact, I think one of the first examples I gave when I wrote this post about all the IRL analogies is someone had said, look, if you leave your door unlocked and open and someone walks into your house, it's not breaking and entering. Actually, it is legally breaking and entering in real life. You don't have to break, you just have to enter. So, that's not a real good example. And as we sort of scroll through and I look at some of the other examples, and incidentally, the way I kicked this off is, remember that piracy ad or the anti-piracy ad from about the mid-2000s? Had a girl sitting at a computer, she's downloading a movie, and then there's some scary music, and it says, you wouldn't steal a car, would you? You wouldn't steal a handbag, would you? Why would you steal music? These things have nothing to do with each other, other than the fact that they're all illegal. You know, this whole premise of someone might have like a Slim Jim, chuck it down the window, unlock the car, get into the car, assumably then hotwire the car in a dark alley and drive it away. To say that that thing is the same as the girl sitting in her bedroom downloading a copy of a movie is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. And I had some examples here where people have just torn it apart with very, very amusing analogies of that. Someone here says, you wouldn't download a car. Then there is a picture of a 3D printer, says, just you, I don't think I can swear in this, otherwise I get YouTube things, just you effing wait. Go and read the blog post. Because you would, if you could. If you could download a car, a bunch of people would. So anyway, getting onto these analogies, we saw a lot of stuff like, let me try and pick a good example here. Is checking for unlocked doors breaking and entering? And there are lots of examples about doors. People got infatuated about doors. Saying, you know, if you just try the door, and effectively the analogy they're trying to make here is that if you go through and you're online and you just keep probing away, changing the URL, it's the same as just seeing if the door is unlocked. But have a think about the IRL example. If I looked down there and I saw someone walking up to my house and trying to open all the doors, we're going to have a very different discussion to if someone comes to Have I Been Pwned and they're trying to see if directories exist or not. This is just not comparable in any reasonable way. But somehow people keep picking up these analogies. Oh, wow, someone's actually deleted one of them. One of the tweets, I embedded the tweets. So the one that's been deleted, I won't say the guy's name because maybe he didn't want it to be here. He says, if you don't have a lock on a door that says, welcome, please enter, it's different to not having a lock on a door saying, restricted area, keep out. Going through the first door without knowing you've been misled doesn't qualify as exploiting a vulnerability. I got to the point with some of these where I just went, this in no way translates to the digital world. Someone, after I said, look, +1 and that's the point to stop, someone said, is it okay if you go into a candy store and you steal one lolly? Oh, no, it's not, because you have taken that lolly away from the candy store. They no longer have it. And what you'll find is that if you do go into candy stores and try and take one lolly, you'll get a very different reaction from the owner of said store to if you go to a website and you change an ID once, because these things don't translate in any single way. So, wrapping up, the broader point was not to try and harp on enumeration, but rather to have a point that I could direct people to every time we see these crazy IRL analogies which just don't translate. I understand people's intent is to try and explain things in ways that normal everyday consumers can understand. Because the cybers do get confusing. I get that. They're trying to just explain things in relatable ways. I would far rather find ways to actually explain what is going on, actually explain the technology. And frankly, I appreciate this is not hard. I'm making a career out of trying to explain it in a way that's consumable. So I know it's not always simple, but please, let's try and just put the IRL stuff aside and actually talk about the technology. Okay, I think that's enough of that. Last thing is sponsorship. So NetSparker is sponsoring my blog again this week. I've spoken about NetSparker many times because I have used them for many years, well before any sponsorship or anything like that. I also just learned they just got $40 million worth of funding as well, which is awesome. So they're getting that funding inevitably because they are onto a good thing. They're building a good product. I use it a lot for dynamic analysis purposes. I was using it at about 2 a.m. this morning in my workshop to demonstrate to people what dynamic analysis looks like. And the reason I use NetSparker and I show it in things like workshops for developers is that it's so easy to see how it works, to actually understand it, and it gives you really neat, actionable items as well. And in fact, the reason I started using NetSparker in the first place is some of the other stuff that was very, very geared towards security pros, the output of those reports, and very often these are hundreds of pages long because, hey, web apps are full of holes. The output of the reports were things that were very hard for normal, everyday developers to actually read, understand, and then go and action. And NetSparker sort of solved all that and made things enormously easy to look at. So NetSpark is up there on the sponsorship bar this week. I appreciate their support, and I appreciate everyone else watching this update. I'll still be here next week. I'm actually going to be in Sydney on Thursday talking at CRN Pipeline again. I did that in Melbourne last week. Next week will be Sydney, so if you're around Sydney, I'll be down in Manly doing that, which is a nice little beachy spot. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I will come to you again from here next week. See you later.